We'll stay with this story now and speak to Emmanuel Matambo, UJ Center for Africa-China Studies Research Director. Good evening to you and thank you so much for your time. President Cyril Ramaphosa saying that while there is an increase in bilateral trade, he's calling for a narrowing of the existing trade deficit and structure of the trade. Your take on this?
And good evening, Wangi, and good evening to your viewers as well. It was quite refreshing actually to hear President Cyril Ramaphosa speak in the way and the manner with which he spoke yesterday. There was a lot of candor and frankness in which he spoke, and somehow that is actually a sign of just how matured South Africa's relationship with China has been. If you look at the trade figures for last year, 2023, the bilateral trade itself, I think, was about 34 billion United States dollars, but then 22 billion worth of that were actually South African imports from China. South Africa only exported about 12 billion worth of goods to China. So there is a very big balance of about 10 billion United States dollars there. So it is a trade equation that is quite important, but obviously it is tilted towards China's favor at the moment. So it was quite refreshing to hear President Cyril Ramaphosa speak about that, because when China talks about mutual development and mutual benefit, and also when it commits itself to improving the value of the exports that Africa makes to China, this is what has been lacking thus far, and it was quite good that President Cyril Ramaphosa brought that to the attention of China.
How far does that go towards ensuring that the trust that is, being built between these two countries then continues to be built over time and strengthened in order to maybe possibly ensure that things aren't skewed in China's favor, as you've said?
Well, one of the things to do actually is to improve when it comes to Africa's skills base. Because even if we want to improve the quality of exports that we send to China, we cannot really improve if we do not have the skills to make sure that we transform the resources that we have into high valuable goods. So there is a need for that. And where can China come in? China can come in by ensuring skills transfer. China can come in as well by making sure that Africa's human resource, because that is the biggest resource that Africa has at the moment, not the minerals. The minerals which are finite. Africa's biggest resource are its young population. So we have to make sure that we skill that particular demographic of Africa, and that then will almost to naturally improve the quality of exports that we send to China. Otherwise, the rhetoric that is usually exchanged at the high level is not going to have any value whatsoever if the demographic of Africa remains unskilled and unemployed.
In light of what you're saying, then I'd like your take on this, because I was reading an article earlier in the African, and they're saying that there are a number of concerns that are raised about this particular relationship, and they say these include trade imbalance, labor practices and job displacement, as well as a debt burden, dependency and sovereignty issues. What's your take?
Well, we can unpack that in different ways there. When we talk about the skilling of Africans, that is a no-brainer. We need that because, our population will probably more than double by the year 2100. We need to skill African people. When it comes to the issue of trade imbalances, we have already spoken about what President Cyril Ramaphosa spoke about yesterday. When it comes to the concerns about debt, I think what has been happening thus far is the fact that as Africans, sometimes we have been absolving ourselves of our responsibility. So when people talk about the debt trap narrative that has gained a lot of traction at the moment, we actually need to take responsibility as Africa, because, well, if China puts at the disposal to Africa the money that we are contracting from Africa, it is quite unfair and disingenuous actually to blame the People's Republic of China for that, because they are obviously a self-interested partner in this. But then we also need to look at how sustainable we are in terms of repaying those debts. Unfortunately, because Africans sometimes we tend to look at winning elections as the priority, we borrow money unsustainably because we want myopic road infrastructure. We want infrastructure that is showy and can easily win us votes without really digging deeper, doing our due diligence in terms of how we can repay that particular debt to China.
Do you see that change in the future? Because you're raising quite a compelling argument to say that priorities may not necessarily be in the right places here, because if the focus is on just winning the elections, then there's a lot that it takes for the continent to then begin to develop? And you speak about a young population around the economy, and that's been the focus of many analysts as well. So do we have right now that hunger or even that ability to be able to change that picture and actually have our priorities in the right places instead of just taking money and then sometimes you don't even see where it goes in terms of development?
Well, it's something that we should aspire to, but it has been hampered by practicalities, actually. The first thing is just the mere realities of the economic sizes of African countries compared to China. China's economy is more than 19 trillion now. Africa's economy is only about 1.4 trillion. So combined, by the way. So it actually helps China to Africa's detriment when China is negotiating with African countries at a bilateral level. So do we have the foresight? Do we have the long-term planning as Africa to make sure that we put the force of the African continent behind as we liaise with China? Because it is just common sense that if we negotiate with China in silos as Zimbabwe, as Namibia, with a population of less than 2 million, it is actually unthinkable that we would have any leverage whatsoever if we are negotiating with China. So if our leaders could put their myopic views aside, they negotiate probably as the African Union, then somehow we might stand a chance of extracting more benefits from China's relationship with Africa than what has been the case hitherto.
So, Emmanuel, it sounds like you're not convinced that we are an equal partner there as we are going to have this particular conversation. So what does it mean for the narrowing then of this existing trade deficit that the president is calling for it to be closed? I mean, if we are not really on an equal footing, what are we doing there?
Well, it's not like I don't sound convinced. I am not convinced, actually, that this relationship is equal. It is not equal. We're just speaking basic realities. The numbers are there for to see. Well, what we should aspire to is a relationship that is beneficial. The numbers that China brings to its relationship with South Africa cannot really realistically be called to be equal to South Africa. China is massively developed. Its economy is massively, infinitely bigger than South Africa's economy. But what we would want to do from this relationship is to make sure that China helps South Africa to scale the type of to improve the quality and the pricing as well of the values that South Africa and Africa in general, by the way, sends to China. The fact that we are still speaking about South Africa-China's relationship brings the inequality even into sharper relief. It would even be better if we were talking about Africa as a continent negotiating with China. As it is right now, yes, I think it will only be the people who are utterly deluded who would think as though it is a relationship between equal partners.
And I wonder then if the continent, as you say, will even be willing to move towards that particular position of, just uniting and then doing something about it. But let's see what happens and what comes out of these particular talks. Keen to hear your thoughts when all of this wraps up. That was Emmanuel Matambo, UJ Center for Africa-China Studies Research Director.